Well, good afternoon, beloved confirmands, and welcome to class number 9. What a journey we've had this year. We've got one more class after this one, so we'll have 10 classes in total for the year. And I've been so thankful for your time and your investment in this process, this learning journey we've had together so far. Your insights and your attention to detail and your responses have been so appreciated, and it's been good to grow together this year. As we begin today, I'd like us to think about a time, I'd like you to think about a time in your life when you were the recipient of hospitality. Now that can happen in a lot of ways. It might be something like someone prepared a special space for you to stay overnight, like when traveling, or maybe at a friend's house for a sleepover or something like that. Or it could be someone remembered a special date in your life, maybe a birthday or a graduation or some other event, some accomplishment that you had that someone remembered. But I want you to think for a minute. When did you receive hospitality? When was someone really hospitable for you? I want you to just keep that in mind and remember the place and the time and who was there and what that felt like. I'm remembering a time when I was young and my grandparents would prepare a space for us in a house out on the prairie in South Dakota, kind of a farmhouse kind of situation. And we'd go out there usually every summer for about a week. And I remember they'd always prepare it specially for us. They'd have our beds made up and our bedroom just so, and some special books and things for us to read, and of course some activities around the property as well that were ready for us. And that felt so special. It always made me feel really special. So hold on to yours, and we'll think about hospitality more in a minute, because before we get there, I want to zoom out a little. Because remember, we're talking this year about stories, about God's story, the overarching story of God, but also all those stories in Scripture that talk about God, and talk about our faith, and remind us of the good news of God in our lives and in the whole world. And stories do a few things, right? We've been over this every week so far this year. Stories do 4 things. They communicate, right? They get some things across. They communicate to us, but they also speak truth. And they touch our emotions. Good stories often touch our emotions. And especially these stories build community. They form us together as people of the church, as followers of Jesus, whom God has brought together. And in our Lutheran tradition, we most often hear stories in worship as we come into the worship space, whether it's virtual, online, as it is often these days, or whether it's in the sanctuary, like it has been at the church building in times past, and will be again when it's safe to do so. But we hear these stories in that space. We hear some preaching often, and even then we eat of Christ's meal after that more often than not. And when we listen to these stories, right, when we take them in and digest them, we're also interpreting them, and every act of interpretation we're asking, right, what's that good news? Like we've said, what's the good news here? And then how do we respond? How do we respond? And so, looking back on where we've been, we remember, right, we started way back at one of the first stories in all of Scripture, in the whole Bible. That story of Genesis, creation, in which we remember that God has created us out of love, that God has created us to be, how did we say it? Wonderful, amazing, impactful, unforgettable masterpieces. And that we then can respond in love as well. And then we talked about the flood and how God floods out all sin and all death from our world, everything that pulls apart at our relationships, and that strains humanity. And God floods all that out. And then God decides that there's a better way to do that, maybe. And that violence isn't the way. And God hangs up that war bow in the clouds, reminding us of the sign of the rainbow, God's promise to not flood the world again. And then we heard Abraham and Isaac, right? And the good news that God provided what was needed in that difficult circumstance, when they learned to look up towards God, for God to provide that ram for the sacrifice as they went up on the mountainside. And then we heard the Exodus story of Moses and deliverance at the Red Sea. This is one of the biggest stories in all of Scripture, but especially the Hebrew Scriptures. And of course, it reminds us that God delivers us from anything that enslaves us, that God is working to undo that abusive power. And just as God did it all those years ago, God is doing it in our world today too. And we can be part of that. We can be part of breaking down those abusive relationships. And then, of course, we had Prophet Isaiah, and Prophet Isaiah's kind of dream for the possibilities in the world, right? Isaiah was in a really tough spot and yet dreamed of this abundance of a time when people could come and eat and drink. They wouldn't have to pay for any of it. There would be enough for everyone to be sustained, and that all those cycles would be broken that make life so hard. And then we heard the Epiphany story, that the Magi coming to visit young Jesus, right? The wise men, sometimes we call them, and the good news of God's light that has shone all around the world, across all of our cultural and religious boundaries, social boundaries, and that God draws all people in to God's self. And then, of course, we heard about the beginning of Jesus' ministry. His prophetic mission means like he's in the same tradition as the prophets, people who often had a hard word to bring for the people of God, to challenge some of the sin that the people were exhibiting, and so Jesus starts out this ministry saying, yeah, God brings good news to the poor and recovery of sight to the blind and healing to the captives and all this radical stuff that God is up to, and then invites us to take part in that ministry too. And then last week we heard the story of Jesus with a Samaritan woman at Jacob's well, and how Jesus brings a different kind of water, a water of new life that quenches a deeper thirst, not just physical thirst. That is part of it. But that somehow Jesus brings us a water that gives us new life. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the sacraments down the road. But then tonight we're talking about, tonight, whenever you're watching this, right now, we are talking about another Jesus story. And this is a resurrection story. And it's the story of Jesus appearing to the disciples on the road to Emmaus. And it's kind of wild because at first the disciples who are there, they don't even realize it's Jesus with them, but he's revealed to them in a special moment, which we're about to hear. So I invite you now to listen to the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke. We're in the 24th chapter. Now on that same day, the day of resurrection, the day when the women were at the tomb and were surprised that Jesus' body was gone, on that same day, two of his followers were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles outside of Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it's now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near to the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." And then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. This is one of my favorite stories in the New Testament scriptures. And I love it because of the way it talks about this simple act of hospitality. That these two followers of Jesus, who would have had to have been close to everyone who was close to Jesus, these two are so sad, and they're leaving Jerusalem. It's been 3 days since Jesus had been killed, and then they got this conflicting news that his body wasn't there, and maybe he was alive, but not everyone had seen him alive, and a lot of uncertainty, I'm sure, and so they're walking away and going back to their own town, and this other straggler comes with them, and lo and behold, this person is all of a sudden telling stories about Jesus and the scriptures and the prophets, and yet they still don't get it until that moment. That moment at the table. That formula. It's the formula we all follow in communion services in the church around the world. It says when Jesus was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. And then they recognized Jesus. And just as they recognized his presence in the breaking of the bread, he was gone. And I love that there's some mystery here. A little bit of unknown, a little bit of mysticism even. But I love how it reminds us that in our own acts of hospitality, that when people are hospitable to us, we can remember Christ's presence in our lives. It doesn't have to just be at the communion table. That is the primary place where that happens, and we give thanks for that. But it happens throughout our lives too. Remember back to the beginning of class today, that time when you were a recipient of hospitality and what that made you feel. That's part of Christ's presence with us. And we now can maybe be that presence for others too. Do you hear that good news and that response? I hope so. I hope so. And so I invite you this week. There will be homework again, a sheet to complete at home together with your family, with loved ones around you. And of course, I invite you again to end that time in prayer, and make sure everyone gets a chance to share a petition as they are able. So I'll be looking for those. I look forward to hearing your insights as you listen to these scriptures in your own place there. And otherwise, keep up the good work with the sermon notes. And I look forward to receiving those as well. Those will be linked in the comments below the YouTube video here, but they'll also be in the email, of course, that you already received. So I look forward to it. Dear confirmands, thank you again for another great class, and may Christ's peace be with you until our next gathering.